So instead of introducing everybody, myself, I prefer these beautiful people to introduce themselves. Alana.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alana. I'm the Senior Health Advisor in the Department of Aging and Life course for the World Health Organization. And I oversee WHO's work on age-friendly environments writ large. Particularly, I lead a global network of age-friendly cities and communities, which covers 381 cities in 37 countries, covering just over 150 million people.
Good afternoon. My name's Lianne Dalziel, and I'm the Mayor of Christchurch in New Zealand. The reason that I'm here, I guess, is because of the experience that our city had back in 2010, 2011, 22nd of February 2011, a devastating earthquake that took 185 lives, has really left our city with considerable challenges. But with those challenges have come opportunities as well. And this is one of the opportunities is for us to really focus on the importance of health and well-being as we reconstruct our city and the communities that live within it.
François.
Good morning, everybody. François Pitti. I'm heading strategic marketing for Bouygues Construction. Bouygues Construction is a construction company, but increasingly involved into the co-design of urban projects worldwide. And by strategic marketing, what we're trying to achieve globally is be more relevant, be more contextual, trying to anticipate what are the social changes on everyday's life, on educations, on healthcare, on mobility, and try to get this back into this innovation, social or technological innovation into our projects. So for us, clearly, social infrastructures are at the core of the city, and it's a key issue we're trying to address collectively.
So let's try to have a lively discussion with short interventions. And my first question, maybe it's interesting for the floor, too, is what do you mean when you use the term social infrastructure? Lianne.
Well, I probably start from the community itself. So the phrase social capital is something that I feel is very important. And particularly when we looked at how different communities responded to the events in Christchurch, the higher the levels of social capital, the quicker communities came together and responded, and the quicker that they were able to recover. So for me, social infrastructure is a supportive city environment from the city government's point of view that enables and facilitates and supports communities to do things for themselves, and out of that comes a greater sense of self-confidence, a greater sense of well-being. So that's probably my definition of social infrastructure.
But you used a new term, another term, which I think would be good to define, which is social capital. Excuse me for this question, but I think it allows a conversation where we are all on the same page.
I guess when I use that phrase, it's about the relationships between people that live in a community or are part of a community. So it's the relationships, the strength of the relationships between those people, but that in itself is not social capital. It's also their collective relationship with the decision makers and how much they are able to influence as a collective the decisions that the city makes.
So Elena, what is your take?
I mean, I would probably build on Lianne's comment in the sense that for me, social infrastructure is that broad policy systems and services, whether we're thinking around housing or transportation, health, long-term care, social welfare, but also the social norms and the prevailing attitudes that exist within those contexts.
François?
Well, to us, historically, I would say the construction company were used for decades to look at buildings, and what we're seeing globally, it's a worldwide need to be thinking in terms of contribution to the city. Lianne, you mentioned enablement, that these boxes are not just spaces, they are enablers for caring to people, enable us for linking the people together, enable us to co-define the city and the city solutions together. So I think what we're trying to contribute as one among many players for this very important topic is try to move into having this small contribution into making the population talk to each other and basically live slightly better.
So I'm sorry to say that when I looked at the definitions, when I was given the responsibility to moderate your conversation, most definitions that I could find were about, spaces, schools, hospitals, and things like that. So what room is there in those social infrastructures in your approach to social infrastructure? So where are the hospitals and the schools and the streets and the spaces? You talk about communities more than about...
Public realm is absolutely critical to a healthy city that promotes well-being. If you don't have public spaces that are free to all, then there isn't the capacity to really provide an even experience for everyone who lives in the city. So, our city, it's funny, is known as the Garden City of New Zealand, and it has land that was set aside generations ago for the public use of the city forever, and right in the heart of the city. So we take it for granted in some respects, but it's absolutely core critical to cities' well-being is to have public spaces and bumping places, where people can interact.
Yeah, I think that the places that you mentioned, so I think generally social infrastructure acts on health in two fundamentally different ways, yeah? So social infrastructure acts on enabling us to have health, sort of our intrinsic health, yeah? By decreasing pollution, by enabling physical activity, by access to decent food. So in that way, building our health, so whether that be, or even just access to healthcare services or education, they're all really important for building our intrinsic capacity, our health. But also, social infrastructure is really important, even when you experience declines in health, for you to continue to do what you value, what's important to you, whether it be through accessible transportation or physically accessible places or access to healthcare services like assistive technologies, wheelchairs and things like that. They enable you to continue to do what you may value and therefore produce health in that broader aspect. So I think all of the places you mentioned are very important in health creation.
François, do you feel isolated in front of these two Kiwi ladies?
Not at all.
This is not a rugby match.
Not only, I don't feel isolated, but I feel many of what was said by Lianne and Alana is what we feel, and where we feel we should act more into the caring dimension. If I take the example of senior housing in France, but across Europe today, and many countries worldwide, got 24% plus of the population above 60 years old, and this is looking at World Health Organization also figures, it is increasing. We need the demands in terms of social interactions, the pattern of the family around is very different, of course, from 20 years before and 40 years before. So we need to think differently, not only about the housing, the content, the materials itself, but also in terms of services that we bring to the housing, where maybe 10 years ago we were focusing more on designing on time, on quality, on budget. We're trying now with associations, with mayors, with partners and stakeholders to look at what could we bring in terms of services also to the housing and to the point also of mobility outside of the house, not to have the house being one place you're being stuck. As a matter of fact, IT technology are bringing huge benefits and the cost is going down, but we need to be also careful to use them at maximum impact to deliver these services, but not to have them also bring us everything to us in one confined environment, which is housing. So what, in summary, I would say in terms of bringing all the social benefit, the service benefit to the, whether it's housing or other infrastructure, this is for us a key element. But also the second dimension, which also Alana mentioned, is get the people to talk to each other. This is why it's not separately schools, universities, hospitals, separately shopping malls, because this is a dangerous world where you commute, you spend 15 hours today, actually these are actual statistics, 15 to 16 hours today in a house. This is average over all age. 6 hours in equipment and 2 hours commuting. And this is not really what social interaction is about. Social interaction is about meeting other people in hybrid spaces closer to your home, talk to them, and not having this back and forth pendulum, life.
Do you see something changing in the concept of housing slowly, because the build is very difficult to move? But for instance, at the Le Monde competition, we had first prize for the European competition, which was about adapting a building in order to have modifiable social places and private places, like a dining room, which could be used for the community at some point or privately at another moment. Do you see things like that happening, or do you see in your, for instance, for you, it could be about intergenerational kind of spaces where people can relate with people of different ages?
A quick answer, but you're French, Francis. In French, for real estate, we've got this ugly word of immobilier, immobile. And I reckon actually, just a few years from now, it won't be immobilier anymore, it will be mobilier, it will be mobile, because the structures are getting flexible, technology enables that. We're going to, and we're seeing already a little bit of Airbnb, the housing being a little bit of hotel, a little bit of the work, a little bit of the university. We're seeing the bathroom becoming a little bit of the clinic right now, with the care that is being concentrated in the bathroom. So all the decentralization of technology will make the housing basically a hub with a kind of a mix of all of these. Of course, it will remain a cozy, we hope, sweet home, but it will change dramatically in terms of being evolutive. I think that's a revolution we're going to see next few years.
I mean, I think this evolution is really important. We see, particularly as people age, the majority of people want to stay in their own homes, but that can become more difficult as they experience declines in health with time. But what we're seeing is great innovations in how to convert existing housing so that people can remain at home for longer. We're also seeing very interesting intergenerational options for housing, for example, in Deventer in the Netherlands, where they've actually brought university students, because they're having so much difficulty finding housing, actually living in nursing homes or with older adults, providing some sort of support so that they can remain at home, but at least they're getting their accommodation covered. A lot of sort of intergenerational housing, in Finland and Switzerland as well, which is really creating opportunities for more intergenerational solidarity, but are also addressing issues around, limited income for younger people and, high costs in terms of real estate and housing. So looking at those creative opportunities that exist in terms of housing is, I think, really an important area to look at.
Do you have examples of that in Christchurch?
Well, I think one of the issues for a city that hasn't gone through our experience is retrofitting can be very expensive, and the time that it takes to recover the costs can be quite considerable. But when we're building our new social housing units that were destroyed in the earthquakes, we're actually building them for all ages. So that they're already meeting the standards for disability support right through life. So that's a much better way of doing it, is to actually build the houses at the start. with that capacity built into it. But housing affordability is another side of that social infrastructure, and I think certainly we have issues in New Zealand, and I know other countries do as well, particularly large cities have great problems with people being able to get on the property ladder, as it were, or get themselves secure housing. And I think different housing options need to be the way of the future. I think people will want to have different types of lifestyles. People may not want to own a house for the rest of their lives, but to, in some parts of Europe, it's much more normal to find, renting, but then with rent controls and with security of tenure.
And what is the importance of third spaces? Because François mentioned that we spend most of our time in our homes, then sometimes, a long time, in our offices, and then the rest normally is going from one to another. But then we have seen emerge the notion of third spaces. First, what do you understand by third spaces? And second, what could the role be?
Well, I guess it's really about being neither housing nor, let's say, traditional equipment whereby you get in one space, one function. University, you're learning, searching, shopping mall, you're shopping. These are much more decentralized spaces, closer indeed to the home, where we've got hybrid uses, and these are the very early stages. We trying as a company to implement this kind of mixed-use space to first answer, I would say, talking to each other, getting these communities to talk to each other. If I take universities, for example, a lot of university presidents are telling us the use of the university space is huge, is about 20 to 25% only. At the same time, they want to open to enterprise, they want to open to citizens, they want to open to cities. So we're trying to think with them how we can get these mixed hybrid spaces in universities, in schools, but also talking about healthcare, proximity healthcare spaces. So we feel that there is a social dimension to get population to talk to each other, rather than having this pendulum movement between the house and the different spaces. There is an economic benefit, because when you've got infrastructure being used at 20% of the time, if you increase just to 30%, you can measure the benefit on a city and on a country. And you've got also mobility effect. We're talking about many countries, 1 hour and a half, France, Europe 2 hours, many countries even more. So you got all this time that you're spending on mobility that you can basically decrease to maybe half in many times. So there are many benefits that are enabled today by simple technology. I think that an experiment that we should watch carefully.
How do you face the situation in Christchurch?
Well, I think that what we've tried to do is to take advantage, really, of some of the spaces that have been created and allow the community to explore what that could produce. So we have an organisation that emerged after the earthquakes called Life in Vacant Spaces, and it's become a catalysing group for a number of others. One's called Greening the Rubble, one's called Gap Filler, and you can hear from the descriptions that I'm using that these are taking spaces on a temporary basis and activating them for the community. If they're successful, well, then that's something that's going to find a place in the Christchurch of the future. If they're not so successful, well, no harm's done. We've given it a go. So, and they're a mixture of different approaches to taking public space or making private space public for a period of time and trialling new things. So I liked what you described as sort of testing new ideas.
I mean, I think these are really interesting and exciting opportunities. I think one of the key factors there, which I think you've both spoken to, is this idea of co-production in a way, the need to consult broadly with the users of those spaces in terms of how to maximize their benefits. So I think there's great opportunities there.
If you allow me, I would suggest we can give the mics to the floor for questions or comments, one or two, not more, because we have more things to address. But we have been around the definition, the main elements. So maybe you have disagreement, comments, questions, please.
The third space that you are referring to, which I believe that those are the transition spaces that mostly students are using during their education, which I believe community should provide that as free to the students as a contribution to their education. And that we have a social obligation to ensure that the education that our children are getting will be something for the good of the future. So
maybe you can tell us if third spaces are limited to students, or how they are taking more importance in the life of older, not necessarily aging citizens.
Our short experience in this field, it's not only for students, it's clearly a benefit, because much more mobile and key to have this kind of flexible spaces. But we see clearly companies, entrepreneurs, startups, and also mentioned healthcare specialists increasingly looking at spaces where you get closer to the population and you get to talk to mingle, to interact with other populations. So I would say students are very early adopters, I would say, of third space. But we feel that this is becoming a much wider phenomenon.
Should we talk about third spaces or hybrid spaces? Or when do we move from one to the other?
I'm also thinking of co-working environments as well, so that they wouldn't be hybrid in the sense that you don't have accommodation there. But we've developed a few of these co-working environments in Christchurch, and they've been a wonderful opportunity, because you get one company, you've got lots of companies, small companies, startups in one place, and so where they go and get coffee together, that's when the conversations happen. I remember going to a really large research laboratory many, many years ago, and I was being shown around, and the guy pointed out all of the little coffee corners all around the place, and he said, "This is where the magic happens. You know, this is when you've got people from different disciplines talking to each other in a casual setting. That's when the experiment that's happening over here suddenly produces the solution for over here." I've always thought that silos and separate spaces in a working environment are actually much more damaging, much higher barriers to actually achieving success.
This makes me think of the Googleplex, for instance, that I visited, and now many big company spaces where you have workspaces, places where you can talk with people, coffee spaces, the famous coffee machine dynamics. And then you have places where you can play ping pong or whatever. So hybridity is happening in some companies today. And I think that even co-working spaces are sort of hybrid. Another question.
I'm an architect from New York. My question is mostly related to in many cities like Hong Kong and New York, there are actually really great social infrastructure already built in the city. In Hong Kong, they got great transportation, great healthcare, and many great facilities. But if you really look at like the people there, like many people, 1 in 7 people actually have mental problem. Like they're either really stressed out, they're really like unhappy. So in some way, like how do we resolve this issue? Like we can have all this like great stuff, but at the same time, if people are not happy with what they have, like how can we how do we activate the space so that people are really using it to relax or really using it to take advantage of all this like great infrastructure?
In terms of I know much more around older adults and the impacts that spaces have. I think a big issue there is around social isolation, for example, of older adults, where they can't necessarily get access to all of these great things, maybe because either transportation doesn't reach them in their home, or they don't have access to the information about these great things that they might be able to get involved in, or they require some other services which may not be available for them to benefit from those. So clearly there is a need for linkages between the opportunities and the resources that exist, and that's often an important problem, where sectors don't necessarily work together so that there's link up, and there's not necessarily adequate information for people to be able to get access to those. And they mean that, in fact, citizens cannot benefit as much as they can from the available services.
So maybe we could move to another question, which is, and I'm thinking of you, Lianne, what is the relationship between social infrastructure and resilience? You're part of the 100 resilient cities. You have very sad but very good reasons to be part of them. Does the notion of resilience change the way we approach these issues?
Well, I use a different definition of resilience. The resilience, what I use the word, I use co-creation, I use adaptation, I use, it's the capacity, it's self-competence, it's the ability for communities. I think of resilient communities as communities that can thrive in the face of a terrible event, or be better prepared for one, should one come along, because of the way they're already interacting with each other. So, and sometimes I don't think that governments can tell communities how to interact with each other. I think that we can be facilitators, enablers, we can support communities to actually take the leadership in determining what it is that their community would like to come together around. So I always use an example of a time bank, where communities help each other out. Individuals are prepared to help on an hour-for-hour basis, not a dollar-for-dollar basis. So they're transacting, but in a human way. When you think of the small towns that we grew up in, well, I did, everyone knew everyone, and there was a sense of reciprocity that governed all of your interactions. And that's often lost in a big city. I think that you can have all the great facilities in the world, but if you don't know anyone else who lives on your floor in your apartment building, it can be really hard to engage with that wider community. So what are the opportunities to bring people together for whatever purpose? Whether it's to make an evacuation plan, or whether it's to grow some community gardens, together.
There is a sentence you may like from Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not a big fan of Mark Zuckerberg, but he said, you don't create communities, you provide them with elegant tools.
Yes, I think that's a very good...
What would be the elegant tools you could provide?
Well, I think my experience is that within communities there are these amazing natural leaders, and if you find those people, then they know how to connect with their communities and to connect their communities with each other. I would resource those communities. We're trying a bit of an experiment in our city at the moment. We've just signed an agreement with central government. So we're going to co-fund, so we're both putting in $1 million each a year for 3 years into a community wellbeing and resilience fund. But the idea is that we reach out and partner with communities so that they can actually build those resilient environments within which people will thrive. But it's no one left behind. I think that's got to be the real key to it, because social isolation is probably one of the bigger killers in our society.
One of the things I find when I visit cities is that you have in many cases municipalities that want to do things, whatever this is, but they don't know what the people are actually doing. So how do you know what people are doing today in order to improve their spaces and build their communities? How do you know what is going on?
You have to go to where the people are.
I mean, obviously in the network that I oversee, communities, and we work with, not yet Songo, but for example, Seoul is an age-friendly city and community, along with the 480 others. And what they do is they consult. So they talk to people within their communities. They talk with broadly in terms of the cross-sector, trying to understand what is actually being done. They work out what the priorities are because you can't do everything. And then they look at, based on those priorities, what is the most effective things that we could potentially do to be able to address those needs. And then they do stuff. And it's that acting and then monitoring, what they do to be able to see whether it's working that actually enables, I think, the creation of better places for all ages.
Yeah, I mean, rebuilding on what Lianne was saying about co-creation, this is now there is not a single major urban project where we're not trying to address with the population what could be these ways of listening at the needs, and to what Alana was saying, look then at the priority, because it could be mind-blowing also trying to solve all of the city problem even on a given urban project. So I'm not sure if it's elegant tools, but we're trying to put together tools. Some are IT tool portals that we're trying to distribute to some of the residents and give the feedback. So put together a game. Why? Because there is also a way when you are trying to envision what a persona is or a character, you're much more, let's say, direct sometimes. And so we're using these 19 characters or persona that we're trying to distribute around residents, mayors, sometimes playing their own roles. And they're telling us what they like about the project, what they don't like. We're trying to see where there is tension, to try to solve the tension. And we're trying, back to what Alana was saying, to look at the 2 or 3 priorities that we're trying to solve, not solve everything. And it often goes back to some social basic needs of talking to each other. Not necessarily buildings, could be public space. So these are small tools, but we're trying to increasingly develop those.
I mean, maybe just a challenge to that one, because my experience is that it's not necessarily about giving cities and communities elegant tools. What I've found is that the power and the expertise and the creativity is local, is in communities and in cities, if the environment can be created to harness that. So at least in the work that I do, and it's a really nice change for me to be able to find that the expertise is actually in cities and communities rather than outside.
So I guess that if I ask you, what's better to approach social infrastructure, top-down approach or bottom-up approach? All of the people in this room will say both.
Middle.
Now, that's the easy answer. There is a famous law which is called the Karlsen's law. And summarized, it means all what is top-down is stupid and all what is bottom-up is chaotic. So there is a contradiction between the order that comes from the top, which is needed, the inventivity that comes from bottom, which is chaotic. How do you solve that? How do you make them actually create?
I've been trying to deal with this. So we had a community network that established itself after the earthquakes, and they adopted a motto that they found, which was the wisdom of the community always exceeds the knowledge of the experts. And so I've reflected on that over a number of years, though, because I think that it's just, and it's your point about the top down, because I think there is a point where they have to meet. And so I've changed that phrase to the wisdom of the community, when combined with the knowledge of the experts, always produces more than what one can produce without the other.
beauty.
I would say it's middle out. So where you need to have, obviously, the overall arching structure and the consultation with local levels, and I think, the perception that they need to meet in the middle in terms of that engagement. So maybe it's not top down or bottom up, but maybe middle out.
Okay, so we have 2 points of view in which there is a lot of room for both approach or middle out. What is the case when you have a big company that is trying to provide services?
What we're trying to do is, again, and this is with a small experiment last few years, we're trying to work in different manner, but it's actually iterative going. So we're doing usually a global benchmark on specific issues, if they are on mobility, if they are on healthcare, trying to see what's the best in Korea, in Singapore, in Africa, in different continents. And then we're addressing with the mayors and the city stakeholders. You would reckon this is kind of a top-down initially, some vision of some best practice, so could be innovative ideas that we couldn't think of. Then would have more a bottom-up with some residents, stakeholders, partners, association telling us, well, this has nothing to do with what's going on here, in this country, in this city, with its culture and history. So this is, there may be this innovation trusting this, and you didn't think of that, that, and that. And then we're going back and forth, back and forth. So it's, I would say, it's never, at least from the way we're trying to contribute, it's usually a mix, but it's an iteration, and you're trying to, of course, at the end, back to what Lianne was saying, the community decides for itself, with the mayor being the key organizer. But we see, we're trying also to capitalize on many good ideas across the world. We've got this, we are lucky in 2017, through internet and digital access to many innovations. So we should capitalize also on what has already been done successfully, but listen to the community to act.
Lianne, as a mayor, how do you value the cost of developing and encouraging social infrastructure?
Well, I think that probably the cost question is round the other way. What is the cost when you don't invest in the social infrastructure? Because it is an investment and not a cost. If you don't have, and I mean, I again like the word happiness being used, because the happiness quotient is probably a better measure than GDP of the measure of health and well-being that we're talking about today. But I think that sometimes you've got to take a bit of a gamble as well, because you don't know whether it's going to produce the result. And I remember reading of an example in the United States where they had an old army base which they had decommissioned, and so they had a lot of accommodation there, and they offered cheap housing to elderly people, but there was a condition that came with the very low rent, and that was that they had a lot of young people who were going off the rails, and they were going to live there as well, and they had to spend an hour with them as part of their condition of living there. Well, that mandatory hour became a voluntary association that was life-changing for both.
Alana, how do you see that from your perspective? The cost.
Yeah, I'm, maybe it's
so you agree on everything.
No, but I really think, in terms of investing, it's really an issue with older adults, because if you listen to anything on aging and population aging, you only hear of it as a tsunami of older adults which is going to send our economies broke, yeah? And I really believe very strongly that the investments that we make, and I use the same word in that sense, in health, in long-term care, in physical and social infrastructure, pay off. They pay off in enabling older people to continue to work for longer, to contribute in other ways, to maintain and maximize their health, and to contribute back to their communities and participate. So I really do think that these are investments, and they're wise investments if we're going to enable our populations to flourish and be happy.
We hear a lot about all these good ideas, beautiful ideas, well-being, healthy cities, and so on. How can we measure that? Because I think there are a lot of beautiful intentions, and actually when you go to the ground, nobody actually knows what is efficient, what works, what doesn't work. In the case of an earthquake, you had excuse me to say so, but a magnificent opportunity to see what was working, but it is sad to have to wait for an earthquake. How do you, are you worried by measuring what you get through developing social infrastructure? And how do you do that?
That's probably the hardest question, because in some respects we're talking about things that are intangible. There are ways of measuring, you know, surveys and the consultations that you do and the feedback that you ask for. But I think in today's environment with new media, there are huge opportunities to actually get very real and upfront personal feedback about how the city is as far as it's achieving its purpose in terms of the well-being of the community. But we've introduced some smart bins in a particular suburb in the city as a trial. Because they were always being overfilled and the seagulls would come and eat out of them, and so the community would say, look, if the city council can't even get the rubbish right, you know, they're going to not get the community right, you know, they're not going to be able to fix our suburb. And so, but once these were installed and operating well, there have been no complaints. And all of the Facebook interactions around rubbish have completely disappeared. So it's a simple measure of just a little thing, but making a huge difference to people's sense of well-being and that their environment is being looked after.
François, do you try to measure that?
Well, it's amazing to see in the last, if I take the last 5 years, maybe 5 years ago, we were being asked to make sure we complete a project on quality and time. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we were asked about satisfaction, and actually we're trying to involve ourselves to be an actor of the urban project, but increasingly we are being asked about happiness and make sure there is a happiness and even sometimes, rare, but increasingly commit to happiness. So how do you commit to happiness? We've been, in the last few weeks, I've been meeting sociologists. I've been a Happiness Institute to try to understand that. I came across as many definitions as possible as what happiness is. So trying to get back to basics, and we're engaging mayors and stakeholders into trying to see what are the basic things we want to have. Well, we want to have smiles, we want to have satisfaction, we want to have interaction, and want to have people talking to each other. And of course, basic needs, social needs. But you know, we've been struggling for now a couple of months around this notion of measuring, committing to happiness. And frankly, at the moment, at least, we're trying to get back to some basics and make sure, at least on this basic, we
are nearing the end. Question, the gentleman here has a question.
So my question to the mayor, when we are dealing with the metropolitan cities, so we are talking about communities. So there are multicultural communities are in the city. How you look at these varying needs, the diversification of the needs of these multicultural communities, how it's reflected in the social infrastructure provision?
Yeah, I think that when I use the word community, I've been probably focusing on communities of geography, but communities of interest and communities of identity are also very much part of that building of social capital within the city. We've just developed a multicultural strategy in order to make sure that no one is left behind. Everyone has the capacity and ability to engage. And I guess the other answer to the question about when do you know that the investment in social infrastructure is paying off and that you do have high levels of social capital that reach out across is that people turn up. People turn up for events, people turn up to have their say, people turn up and actually commit to contributing to the community in whichever way the call goes out. So we've had more than our fair share of disaster lately. We had some terrible fires in our Port Hills, destroyed so much forest, and people have been turning up and planting those trees, and they are going to be magnificent again, but they've turned up, and every community's turned up.
I would like to ask two last questions with one-word answer to each of you. Three. First, what is the importance of diversity in social infrastructure, or what we have been talking about? Alana.
I mean, incredibly important in terms of the diversity to which social infrastructure has to respond. And I think that there is a real responsibility to level up and ensure that nobody's left behind, and making sure that all people are able to benefit from social
But diversity means different...
diversity in capacity, in belief, in anything. Yeah.
Lianne.
You cannot take on complex challenges without diversity of thought. You cannot. So if you've got a group of people who've all got the same background, or all got the same gender, or all got the same interests in life experience, then you're going to get groupthink, and when they get it wrong, they'll all get it wrong.
The diversity applies to different ethnic background and cultural background,
absolutely.
which might not be...
Full range of diversity.
Okay. François?
Well, I would say that today more than ever you need to have these groups that are not talking to each other, or less and less talking to each other, becoming communities, co-create, co-think the city. And this means that cities, stakeholders, partnerships with associations, companies should really think that globally. And so diversity to me is...
You've been very long in these answers. Last one was one sentence. How do you define... So we have been talking about a lot of innovation, so on. Social innovation, what is it for you? Very short.
Products, the way we think, the way we act, what we do and what we think.
Without or with technology? You don't care.
Yeah.
Lianne.
I think technology is going to be a great enabler, and it will be able to reach across generations, but we cannot have this digital divide where, again, you've got a generation, myself included, left behind, unable to fully take advantage of the technology, but it's an enabler.
But social innovation.
Social innovation is... social innovation, I don't know how I would describe that. From a societal point of view, social innovation is being willing and able to do things differently, and not seeing services in silos, but actually seeing them from the perspective of the person and the community within which they live.
François, very brief.
I would say it's taking steps, that could be small steps, to increase, as you mentioned, the linkage between the people. We've talked about hybrid space, we talked about time bank. This doesn't cost anything. You get how digital technology has zero cost to enable this linkage to be made. So I think it's up to us.
Thank you very much for this beautiful conversation. Thank you for your questions.